We're going to talk about the Cold War in the Americas, maybe focusing a little bit more outside of the United States today. We want to remember that relationship between the United States and Latin America isn't born, of course, during the Cold War. And in fact, we spent a lot of time this year already talking about that relationship. At the turn of the century, this goes back to, guys, what you studied last year. The United States employed the Monroe Doctrine. You guys remember this from last year? The United States employed the Monroe Doctrine and kind of added on and enhanced that in the early 20th century to say that Latin America was our backyard and we treated them very much. As we get into the 1930s, the United States attitudes and treatment of Latin American nations changed. Do you guys remember what that was all about and how that went down or why that went down? The good neighbor policy of President Franklin Roosevelt, very good. The good neighbor policy, and this was in the mid-1930s when the United States was concerned twofold about economic issues because of the Great Depression, and we were concerned about security issues with tensions in Asia, with Japan, and tensions in Europe with Germany and Italy in the mid-1930s. And so we wanted better economic relations with Latin American countries, and we wanted better diplomatic ties with Latin American countries because we didn't want any Latin American nations to join with maybe the Germans or to join with the Japanese. We wanted everybody to remain at least neutral in the 1930s. As we get involved in World War I, or World War II, pardon me, then we become strong advocates of Latin American nations to join the war effort. And of course, we get help from some Latin American nations, primarily nations like Brazil and Mexico, in the fighting of the Second World War. In the Cold War, the story is going to change again, all right? And the United States is going to go for a time back before the good neighbor policy. Because in the Cold War, now the world is looking like one in which communism is moving to spread, and the United States policy towards that is one of containing communism. We don't want to see communist powers or communist states, communist governments taking hold in Latin America. And so after World War II, the United States is going to attempt to reassert a more dominant position with regard to Latin America in order to keep Latin American states from becoming communist states. In 1947, the United States and most Latin American countries will sign what's known as the Rio Treaty, which is a mutual defense agreement, kind of in line of what we would have seen during the good neighbor policy of President Roosevelt. 1947, it's a mutual defense. If any nation attacks any signatory of this Rio Treaty, then it is going to be considered an attack by all. An attack on any nation that signs the Rio Treaty is an attack on all nations. So even if Brazil is attacked or Argentina or Chile are attacked, as far south in South America as you can go, the United States is committing themselves now to the defense of the American states. This is the Rio Treaty. Now, this is right before the United States is signing another major defensive agreement in the Cold War era called NATO. So this comes right before NATO, and we notice that Canada is not in this Rio Treaty, but Canada is, of course, going to be in the NATO agreements. The United States had other agreements with Canada. So this is essentially saying the Western Hemisphere is an American sphere, and outside powers should stay out. Kind of echoing what we've long said, even going back to the Monroe Doctrine. In 1948, the Organization of American States will be formed. In 1948, the Organization of American States will be formed. The OAS, which includes the United States. And the membership in the Organization of American States is going to commit those nations to non-interventionism, like to not get involved in affairs of the globe, or not intervene with each other, I should say, not intervene with each other, but also economic cooperation between these American states and ideals of democracy. And in 1948, it becomes a statement of the Organization of American States. It becomes a statement of the Organization of American States that communism is not compatible with freedom. That communism is incompatible with freedom. And it shouldn't be surprising that the United States is working on such an organization in 1948 at the advent of the Cold War, right? So 1948, Organization of American States trying to get everybody in Latin America on board with the idea of economic cooperation and that communism does not go hand in hand with freedom.
Enter back door.
Someone's got to get that back door.
Enter back door.
In the 1960s, President Kennedy will launch what is known as the Alliance for Progress. The Alliance for Progress. Think of the Alliance for Progress of President Kennedy to be kind of like a Marshall Plan for Latin America. The idea of the Alliance for Progress is that billions of dollars in economic aid will be pumped into Latin American friends. So the United States sending billions of dollars in aid into Latin America with the hope that those countries will not be seduced by communism. That those countries, as they are made more economically viable because of this aid, will be less likely to turn to communism. This can be seen as an aspect of President Kennedy's foreign policy during the Cold War, continuing like a Marshall Plan that was begun in the Truman administration, but now for Latin American nations. There would be some critiques of this Alliance for Progress, in that the United States was spreading money around based on its own national self-interest, rather than the actual betterment of these nations. Like, for example, that our only true goal was to keep these countries anti-communist, rather than really trying to improve any economic conditions in these countries. For example, much of the aid for the Alliance for Progress is going to go to strengthening some militaries in South American nations, which helps them stop any communist infiltration, but doesn't necessarily help out the poor in those nations. Of course, as the United States is going to get more and more involved in Vietnam and Southeast Asia, what do you think is going to happen to the available resources to send to Latin America? They'll drop. So as we begin to grow our escalation in Vietnam, we're going to have less money to spread into Latin America. The United States will also be pumping money and the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, into Latin America in order to stop communist groups from gaining control in Latin American nations. So the United States will use the CIA and American funding to train South American militaries to stop communist paramilitary groups. You guys know that phrase, paramilitary? It means like outside the normal military. So in Latin America, a paramilitary group would be like a guerrilla group or some kind of insurgent group that might want to bring down the government that's supported by the United States. Well, we are going to send in our CIA to train some of these armies of South America to stop these paramilitary groups. Very similar to what we're doing in South Vietnam, right? That we're sending the American Army as advisors into South Vietnam to train the Army of the Republic of Vietnam to stop Viet Cong fighters in South Vietnam. Doing much the same in Latin America. The problem is, what results out of our aid and the strengthening of militaries in South America and the suppression of government group or opposition groups in these countries is we end up supporting a number of military dictatorships in South America. As the United States aid is directed into militaries, and militaries grow in strength and power in Latin America, and the United States government offers their support, as opposition groups are silenced and sometimes eliminated, it only makes these governments even stronger. So as the United States had started off this relationship during the Cold War, advocating for democracy in the Americas, we end up supporting a number of military dictatorships. Now, don't get me wrong. These are like right-wing, anti-communist military dictatorships. But they are still military dictatorships that have terrible records on human rights issues. So you get the United States in the name of the Cold War and in the name of containment, really standing against things that the United States traditionally hasn't stood for, right? And it starts to make us look a little hypocritical with our actions in Latin America. We're going to run through a series of interventions that the United States made in Latin America to support our containment policy in Latin America. Now, initially, when countries started to be all dictatorship-like, like even in Cuba, and we're going to talk more about Cuba in a few minutes, even in Cuba, when the dictator of Cuba in the 1950s, a guy named Fulgencio Batista, I'll go over him in more detail in a few minutes, a guy named Batista, as he became more harsh and more repressive, the United States began to pull support from Batista. But guess what happened to Batista once we pulled support from him? Castro wins. Batista falls. So the Cuba example tells the United States, guys, even a bad dictator is better than a communist regime in South America. So the United States begins to use our military or our CIA to support leaders in South America that might very well be bad dictators. And we do this in a number of cases. Let's talk about Brazil first. In 1964, the CIA is going to back and support a military coup. We're going to use this word a lot today. A military coup, an overthrowing of the democratically elected president.
Does it matter who the president is?
I'll give you his name. I will probably pronounce it poorly, but it is João, J-O-A-O, Goulart, G-O-U-L-A-R-T. Because in 1964, the president of Brazil, this Goulart, restored economic and diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. And that made the United States nervous. So we used the CIA to support an overthrow of his leadership. But that guy was democratically elected. The people of Brazil chose him. And the United States are using our CIA to overthrow that. And a new right-wing military leader comes to power. You guys cool when I'm using these phrases, right-wing and left-wing? Communist, leftist. Communism is a political ideology of the political left. So opposition, fierce opposition to communism, tends to come from the political right. All right? So a right-wing military leader takes power in Brazil. In Ecuador in 1964, the CIA, get this, the CIA actually started bombing right-wing agencies and churches in Ecuador, but put the blame on left-wing groups to discredit them. And as the president of Ecuador refused to break relations with Cuba, the CIA supported a military takeover of Ecuador. By the Ecuadorian military, but a military takeover nonetheless. And the leader of Ecuador was ousted, and elections in Ecuador were canceled. This sounds kind of shady, doesn't it? Yeah. Now, can I call a brief timeout? What is justifying these anti-democratic actions by the United States? Yes?
The NSC 68.
Okay, that communism is connected to Moscow, sure, but like, what is so bad about communism that justifies us taking these measures to avoid it in our backyard? Yes?
Fear of another Cuba, the Soviets, any opportunity to spread.
Very good. In Cuba, remember, the Soviet Union put nuclear warheads in Cuba. We got as close to nuclear war as we had ever gotten. What happens if there's another Cuba, or another 3 or 4 Cubas, or 5 Cubas, or 10 or 12 Cubas in Latin America? How do we control all of that? And then how are we going to justify our human rights abuses? That the United States is supporting governments that are absolutely trampling on the basic human rights of their citizens? Well, kind of turns into a situation of, we thought it would be worse if communists were in there. Does communism have any major good record of support for human rights? No. No. And do we have any examples in the mid-1960s that countries becoming communist was disastrous for the people? China would be a great example. So we can actually, despite the fact that we're supporting brutal military dictatorships in South America, we could still claim a moral high ground by saying, you know what, this maybe is distasteful, we don't like having to do this, but the alternative is far worse, all right? But it still doesn't look very good as we talk about ideals of democracy around the planet. Dominican Republic in 1965, this is an island in the Caribbean, right? Dominican Republic in 1965. The United States under Lyndon Johnson will actually send over 30,000 American troops in Dominican Republic in 1965 to support the government of the Dominican Republic against a coup from a left-wing group, from a communist group in the Dominican. Again, this goes back to the Rio Treaty, right? An attack on one is an attack on all. If we saw the government of the Dominican Republic threatened, we would support them even with our military. In Bolivia, and this is going to stretch from the mid-60s all the way to the late 70s. In Bolivia, the United States will back a right-wing Bolivian government. And the CIA and American Special Forces will help the government of Bolivia keep down anti-government forces. Yes, sir?
That's where she.
Very good. That was going to be my next point. Che Guevara, an important figure in the Cuban independence movement, is actually going to be captured and killed later in Bolivia. But we'll talk about Che in a few minutes here.
What exactly?
Yes, ma'am?
So the U.S. helped back the right-wing government?
So there's a right-wing government, an anti-communist government in Bolivia. In the United States, we put our support behind that government. And that government is brutally repressive to opposition forces, particularly left-wing forces. And so we help the Bolivian government essentially fight a civil war in its own country. In Chile in 1970, in the early 1970s, the Chileans elect, in a democratic election, a left-wing Marxist named Salvador Allende. I will spell that for you. Salvador Allende. Allende. The United States is going to oppose this election of Salvador Allende. And President Nixon is concerned that this gives Cuba an ally in South America. So the United States worked to oppose his election. And even after Allende was elected, we continued to discredit and work against his government. Ultimately, Allende would be threatened by a military takeover of his nation, and he ultimately would kill himself in place, and then a harshly repressive dictator would rise to power in a guy named Pinochet in Chile. In the late 1970s, under President Jimmy Carter, the United States changed our tune towards Latin America. And you guys remember we talked last week that someone like Ronald Reagan would have called Jimmy Carter weak on communism? And that was part of the reason that Reagan is going to storm in and win that election of 1980. Jimmy Carter becomes president in 1977. Jimmy Carter makes as a focal point of his election campaign in 1976, Jimmy Carter makes human rights a focal point of his election campaign in 1976, and a key to his foreign policy as he's president. That the United States, he says, should be a promoter of freedom worldwide. And according to Jimmy Carter, he saw our dealings in Latin America as problematic. How can we support ideals of freedom and democracy around the globe? How can we challenge the Soviet Union and say that they violate human rights when we are supporting nations that are doing every bit the same thing in Latin America? So under Jimmy Carter, the United States made moves to hold both allies and enemies accountable for human rights violations. Yes, sir.
I was just going to bring up, like, I think it was like a year and a half ago, I was at a convention at in Detroit, actually,
Yeah.
the Kobo Center, it was like an Islamic convention.
Yeah.
And they actually brought Jimmy Carter to speak, and he also spoke on, like, human rights as well.
Jimmy Carter has, in his post-presidency year, become one of the strongest advocate for Palestinian nationalism and Palestinian, like a two-state solution and ending the conflict in the Arab-Israeli conflict. He's been quite a vocal advocate for the Palestinian cause. And so, yeah, it's not surprising that they brought him out. So you heard him speak?
Yeah.
Very cool, very cool. It's not often that normal people like us get to hear presidents speak. So very cool. Yes, sir.
Okay. I was listening to the Republican debate, one of them recently, and I think it was Rubio called Carter like the worst president in recent history.
Yes.
Would it be because of this that he sees it as
Okay.
weaker?
Yeah, well, one, you would more likely hear someone call Jimmy Carter the worst president in recent history if it was coming from the Republican debates. I would venture to say Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton would have different opinions of the presidency of Jimmy Carter. But yeah, a lot of this, Jimmy Carter's foreign policy record has been deeply scrutinized, and this is a part of it. Those that supported Ronald Reagan in the 80s, those that saw the United States position in the Cold War weakening during the détente period, and certainly during the Carter administration, would absolutely say it was a failure. And they would look at someone like Reagan, who came in with his muscles flexed, talking about boosting American military and standing strong again in the face of communism, as being the way the United States should be acting today. I think there's a lot of parallels between this Cold War story that we're talking about here and the current, war on terrorism, dealing with American adversaries around the planet. I think there's a lot of parallels, so it's worthwhile to have these discussions. So Carter says, we can't treat just because you're an ally of the United States doesn't mean we can turn a blind eye towards human rights violations. But this, of course, is going to strain some relationships. If you are a friend of the United States, or if you thought you're a friend of the United States, and a new president comes in, and all of a sudden the tune has changed dramatically, this could weaken American prestige with some of our allies. Jimmy Carter's administration starts to suspend financial aid to nations like Chile and El Salvador because they have violated human rights. Nicaragua as well.
Wait,
What's up?
does he said he reduces aid?
He's going to reduce aid. Like even if you were a friend of ours, if you are practicing in what we consider human rights violations, we will stop sending you supportive money. No more financial aid. Opponents like Ronald Reagan in that 1980 election are going to accuse Carter of damaging the United States' ability to wage war against the communism or wage this Cold War against communist nations. So if you are a Reagan supporter, if you're on that right side of the political spectrum, you feel Carter has weakened the United States, not made us as strong in the face of our adversaries. I had a hand over here. Yeah.
What's an example of a human rights violation?
Like not allowing political groups to have a voice, actually like torturing people like that are political opponents, or suppressing legitimate votes and things like this. We could see those as human rights violations. In 1978, Jimmy Carter will sign a treaty, or will work out a treaty with Panama. It's ultimately signed by the Senate, called the Panama Canal Treaty. This comes out of over a decade of Panamanians clamoring for control of the Panama Canal Zone. Now, brief reminder, there's a canal that goes across Panama, connects the Atlantic Ocean essentially to the Pacific Ocean, right? It's one of the most important waterways in the world. We dug it, like literally and figuratively. We thought it was really cool and important, and we like literally dug the hole. Well, I mean, our conscripted laborers dug it, I guess we could say. Our deeply underpaid laborers dug it. So we created the Panama Canal, and we controlled the Panama Canal Zone. This was a part of a deal worked out between the United States and Panama back in the late 1800s when Panama was wanting their independence. Do you guys remember talking about this briefly last year? When Panama wanted to be independent from Colombia, the United States supported Panamanian independence, but the catch was, we're going to dig our canal and we're going to control that canal zone. The treaty that Jimmy Carter is going to sign with Panama is going to give control of the Panama Canal Zone back to Panama in 1999. And today, that is the case. The Panama Canal is now in control of the nation within which it lies. There was little popular American support for this move by Jimmy Carter, particularly from the political right and from his opponent in the 1980 election, Ronald Reagan. And in fact, you can see here a button that was used during the presidential campaign of 1980 by Reagan supporters. Panama Canal can't be defended, so I'm giving it away. Forget my sworn oath of office to defend the USA. All right, it's not the best poem ever, but it's a nifty campaign slogan for Reagan supporters. So basically saying Jimmy Carter is giving away this most important asset for the defense of the United States. For example, if you are the United States and you have to get a navy from the eastern seaboard to the Pacific quickly, and something happens, let's say Panama turns communist, and the communist government of Panama no longer allows the American Navy to go through there. How do we get from the Pacific to the Atlantic, or vice versa? Got to go all the way around South America. Got to do it like we did it back in the 1800s. So this was seen as highly damaging towards American foreign policy and American national security. And this is seen as another reason that Carter is going to be ousted from the 1980 presidential election. Another reason he's going to lose that election. Yusuf.
If the treaty was signed in 1978, how come it took 20 years for the Panama Canal to actually return?
Yeah, we take time on such things. You know, because the United States has major operations in Panama, of course. And so a lot of times these treaties are really pushed into the future. You know, you guys might remember in AP World learning about the British in Hong Kong, getting a 150-year lease on Hong Kong. Well, these things sometimes take a long time to pan out. Questions, comments? Yes.